Hello and welcome to the program. I am Onyi Adekunle. President Muhammadu Buhari has laid down the 2021 budget estimates before the joint session of the National Assembly for consideration and approval. The 13.08 trillion naira budget, which is tagged Economic Recovery and Resilience, is predicated on an oil benchmark of $40 per barrel, with an official exchange rate of 379 naira to a dollar. Projected revenue is also pegged at 8.433 trillion naira, leaving a deficit of 5.2 trillion naira. The National Assembly is supposed to give this a speedy consideration so as to sustain the January to December budget cycle. But joining me now to discuss more on this is Johnson Chukwu, an investment banker and the CEO of Cowrie Asset Management based in Lagos. So thank you very much, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we've never had a budget like this expensive before, 13.08 trillion naira. What do you make of it?
Well, two things. In the first place, I have to look at two factors. One is that the value of the local currency has depreciated. So if you compare that to the 10.8 trillion naira of 2020 budget, and you consider the fact that the exchange rate for 2020 budget was less than about 325 or so, compared to now 379 that the government is in for preparing the 2021 budget. So you have seen a shift in exchange rate. So in dollar terms, it may not be materially higher than all the previous budgets. Secondly, the government now is trying to deflate the economy, and therefore is going to be spending a lot more to inject within the economy as to reflect it. And the third factor is that the government has brought in about 60 government-owned businesses into the federal government budget. According to the Minister of Finance, the 2020 budget had only 10 government-owned agencies incorporated into the budget. This time around, they are incorporating about 60 of the government-owned agencies, which means the revenues of these agencies and their expenditure are now embedded in the federal government budget, which further helped to increase the amount of the budget. So these three factors must have contributed to seeing such a huge amount of money, 13.08 trillion naira, which in naira terms is the highest we've seen so far. But in dollar terms, if you adjust for the exchange rate changes and adjust for the inclusion of the government-owned enterprises, then you may not have a budget. It may not be actually materially higher than the previous year's budget.
So compared to last year's budget, do you think we are going to get it right this time?
Well, the key thing is not whether we're going to get it right. The key challenge is that we're going to achieve the revenue projections. The greatest challenge we've always had in the implementation of the budget is inability to achieve the revenue projections. If you look at the minister's pronouncement, the Minister of Finance pronouncement, she said that at the end of July, the current 2020 budget had only achieved 68% of revenue projections, whereas the expenditure budget had been attained to the extent of 92%. And if you do not achieve the revenue projections, it becomes difficult to meet all the expenditures unless the government have to go on a borrowing binge. So the challenge would remain, can we achieve the budgeted revenue projections of 7.9 trillion naira, so that we only deal with the planned deficit of 4.45 trillion naira. But if we don't achieve that revenue projection, which I think is overly optimistic, then the budget becomes difficult to implement.
Now, let's look at the revenue projections as presented by the president now. 8.433 trillion naira, of which oil 2.01 trillion, non-oil 1.49 trillion naira. As you rightly said, you said it's overly optimistic. I mean, that's what you said, taking your word now. In terms of revenue, we're actually not doing so well. So do you get the impression that this revenue this time now, that we may not actually be able to achieve what is planned?
Yes, that's what I said earlier, because if you consider the fact that we're actually still in an economic recession period, and that the economy will recover next year, then if you look at some of those revenue heads, the oil budgeted oil revenue looks realistic in the sense that the government is planning 1.86 million barrels per day, and then a budget benchmark of $40 per barrel. So that looks realistic because it's within our OPEC quota of 1.5 million barrels. So the 1.46 million barrels will be crude, and the other 400,000 will be condensate. So in terms of revenue projections, I think coming from, as it relates to the oil projection, I think that looks realistic. The problem would be other revenue sources, tax revenue from customs duties, independent revenue sources. It will be difficult to achieve those targets because as it stands today, many corporate organizations are going to struggle to make profits place of paying tax next financial fiscal year. Similarly, in terms of importation with the difficulties in assessing foreign exchange, you're going to see a decline in importation, which will affect the customs revenue. The other independent sources are also likely going to experience some level of shortfall this year, given that government, so the government may not be able to achieve its revenue projections apart from the oil and gas revenue source. So I think, give and take, even if you just oppose this against the figures we achieved last year, I mean, total revenue of the government last year was only 4.1 trillion naira. And now the government is projecting more than almost 8 trillion naira in the new year. So I think that will be overly optimistic. The main challenge will be the individual revenue sources other than the revenue coming from oil and gas might be difficult to achieve.
And I mean, just this week, on Wednesday precisely, the Senate approved as much as 4.28 trillion naira loan for the government in order to fund the expenditure of the 2021 budget. And now we look at debt servicing, about debt service 3.124 trillion naira. What do you make of this?
Well, that is most expected. If you look at the fact that the government has borrowed additionally this year, our debt has gone materially higher than what it was in the previous years. And in 2019, our debt service was about 2.45 trillion naira, which by the time we look at what the figures would be in the current year, I think even a 3.1 trillion naira projected revenue debt service for next year looks like conservative. Our debt service next year will be higher than that 3.1 trillion naira budgeted that they have in the budget. The key thing is that if you continue to borrow, you should know that the cost of servicing your debt will continue to increase. And if you consider the fact that I said earlier, last year our total revenue was, federal government revenue was only 4.1 trillion naira. By the time you spend about 3.1 trillion naira servicing debt, you end up dealing with a debt service to revenue of more than 70%. And that's the way the challenges are going to come from in government's ability to implement the budget.
And just to echo your statements, the president also admitted at the presentation that revenue generation remains the major challenge of the government. Now, if you were speaking to authorities now, what would you advise? What areas should the government turn to now in terms of jacking up revenue?
My approach to revenue generation for the government is let's increase the size of the cake. You see, the basic thing that government revenue should be tax-based. And you can only have strong tax revenue if you have a strong economy. If the business is operating in that economy and individuals in that economy are prosperous. So we need to create an economic environment that businesses find suitable, find attractive to operate. Similarly, when you do that, you're also going to create employment for these people so that even at the state level, their tax revenue will also increase. The key thing that you cannot continue to make a few cows. The appropriate should be to increase the number of cows. The government should focus on what are those policies we need to incentivize the private sector, both local and international, to invest directly into the economy, go into productive activities, expand the GDP, so that the tax revenue of the government will grow. That's my approach to it. It's not necessarily to increase the tax burden on the few individuals or few companies who are paying the taxes.
All right, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, please let's just go on a short break here, and when we return, we'll continue this conversation. Please stay with us. Welcome back, and thank you for staying with us on Analysis. We're still discussing the 2021 appropriation bill, which has just been presented to the National Assembly by President Muhammadu Buhari. And I still have on the program Mr. Johnson Chukwu, an investment banker and CEO of Cowrie Asset Management Limited. Thank you, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, for staying with us on the program. Now, the National Assembly will soon begin debate on the budget now. If you were to talk to them now, what areas would you ask them to probably take away when you look at the figures presented by the president?
You know, I did mention earlier that I think some components of the revenue projections look a bit optimistic. So the National Assembly need to look at those revenue sources. Does the government have the capacity to generate as much revenue from independent sources, from its tax sources? If that is not feasible, then they need to adjust the budget. And one of the areas that we're having difficulties that we've continued to see increase in the non-debt recurrent expenditure of the government. Particularly, one is personnel costs, and then you have the other costs. Personnel costs, they may not be able to do much about that. But if in the medium, long term, the government wants to restructure its balance sheet and the profit and loss of the government, they should look at the idea of rationalizing some of the administrations and the departments. The president has actually given authorization that the overlapping ministries should be rationalized. I'm not aware that anything is being done in that respect. We need to run a slimmer government so as to cut down on the government overhead and free up resources for capital expenditure. As it stands today, this will require a lot of political will. The legislator working with the government to eliminate where you have overlapping agencies that are currently consuming a part of our government revenue without necessarily creating additional value in the economy.
And the government has repeatedly talked about lifting 100 million Nigerians out of poverty. Now, with this budget and all of the plans and policies that the government is putting in place, how realistic do you think this would be?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to stop pushing more Nigerians into poverty. As you may have known, the World Bank said that as 2018, Nigeria had about 87 million extremely poor people. If you look at the World Poverty Clock, Nigeria has the highest number of poor people globally, including we're actually overtaking countries like India. And unfortunately, our GDP has continued to grow at a rate that is less than our population growth rate. As long as your GDP is not growing above your population growth rate, you are going to continue to see an increase in the number of poor people. So the first thing is that we need to grow the GDP in an inclusive way, so that more people will no longer continue to be pushed into poverty. That's the starting point. So we're going to reverse from a negative before you talk of growth. And I think it's an altruistic ambition, but it requires a lot of work. I had mentioned earlier, for you to achieve that, the government philosophy as it relates to economic incentive or economic support will have to change, which is where there has to be a shift from a handout-based economic support system to a production-based economic support system, such that citizens will have opportunity to be gainfully employed, earn income, instead of the current arrangement where government focus is to give out handouts to the poor, and they continue to live on handout and they continue to live. But if you create an economic environment, people get jobs, they will be taken out of poverty, unlike a handout system that gives you a meal to eat in a day and another meal to eat another day, and then you remain as poor as you were.
And lastly, before I let you go, let's talk about level of implementation now for the budget. Of course, the government, the Buhari has tasked all MDAs to try and generate more revenue. And in the past, we've also seen cases of budget padding in budgets of ministries. Let's take the NDDC, for example, now. So going forward, in terms of implementing budget estimates now, budget generally, what exactly should we be doing differently?
Well, I think the starting point is to go back to the budget cycle of January to December, which gives the government a seasonal benefit of implementing capital expenditure component of the budget, which is actually the most important component of the budget. Prior years until just last year, budgets were approved around May, June, or July. So in those instances, the government had little opportunity to implement the capital components. And then it takes away the uncertainty. Implementing the budget from January will take away the uncertainty associated with not knowing what the government's policy directions will be. So it will also help private operators, business operators to, from day one, know how to position their businesses. So that's the first thing. Budget cycle has to revert to January to December. 2, the ministers must reduce their budget into deliverable targets. And the president or the presidency should hold the ministers accountable based on the deliverables. Those deliverables should be measured at specific regular intervals. It's going to be monthly appraisal periods or quarterly appraisal periods, such that where deviations occur, they could be addressed before the end of the fiscal year. If you do just these 2 things, you're going to see a lot more effectiveness in the implementation of the budget.
Mr. Johnson Chukwu, MD, CEO, Cowrie Asset Management Limited, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us on this very important matter. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
All right, so that's where we draw the curtains on this episode of Analysis. Thank you so much for staying with us. I'll see you again next time. Bye for now.